When learning about American history, it's often easy to begin the story with Roanoke, Jamestown, and Plymouth Plantation. They were the first English colonies and what would become the 13 mainland colonies for the British. The city of St. Augustine, the oldest continuous settlement in North America, should not be overlooked. The focal point of the city, the Castillo de San Marco, has a beauty which matches the city it resides in. Let's take a closer look at the oldest fort in the United States and bring the past into the present. Everyone seemingly knows about the Spanish conquistadors and the discovery of Florida by European explorers. Tied in with that is the just as famous quest by Ponce de Leon for the Fountain of Youth. But before the Spanish could establish a foothold in this new land, the French established Fort Caroline on the banks of the St. Johns River near present-day Jacksonville in 1564. Not to be outdone by a rival country, the Spanish began building a settlement at St. Augustine in 1565, and on September 20th of that year, a force led by Pedro Menendez de Avilas marched north and occupied the French establishment. The Spanish colony at St. Augustine thrived, and became a safe haven for the Spanish fleet returning from the Caribbean with their treasures. But it was not to last, as the British began colonizing the American coast. The small, fledgling experimental colonies began to grow, and in 1670, the town of Charlestown in South Carolina sprang up, and was a 2-day sail from St. Augustine. The threat of another rival nation prompted the city to become fortified, and a fort to be established. 2 years prior, English privateer Robert Searles raided the city, prompting Governor Francisco de la Guerra y de la Vega to order construction of a fort to be designed by Ignacio Daza. Construction began outright in 1672 with coquina shells used in the masonry. It would stand on the northeast end of the city and connect the northern wall and the gate. It would take nearly 25 years to complete this amazing structure. In 1695, it would become and remain the oldest masonry fort in America. It would be named Castillo de San Marco, translated to St. Mark's Castle, and would be named Fort St. Mark by the British. But more on that later. The fort would be completed just in time, as the 18th century in the American continent was one of warfare that would lead to the Age of Revolution. Starting in 1702, Queen Anne's War would be waged in America, while in Europe it was known as the War of Spanish Succession. England and Spain would go to war, and in the first year of the war, the Carolina colony governor James Moore would lead a raid on the fortified city of St. Augustine. For 2 months, 1,500 residents and soldiers were crammed inside Castillo de San Marco, while Governor Moore held it under siege. The siege would be lifted when Spanish ships arrived off the coast from Havana. The Castillo de San Marco and St. Augustine would see no more major action in Queen Anne's War, but in 1738 it was decided to redesign aspects of the fort. Pedro Ruiz de Olano would install vaulted ceilings, replace some wooden structures, and create deeper rooms. Again, these upgrades occurred at the right time, as Spain and England once again went to war in the War of Jenkins's Ear. This time, it was Georgia Governor James Oglethorpe who would lead a siege against the Spanish stronghold. 300 soldiers and 1,300 citizens huddled inside the fort's safe masonry walls while it was bombarded for 27 days. St. Augustine would return to a relative quiet in 1748 at the conclusion of that conflict. However, war would once again break out on the continent, one that would lay the groundwork for a revolution, the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War as it's known in Europe. In 1763, the British would finally take control of the fort, but not by conquest. Because Spain was allied with France, the fort and the Florida colony would be transferred to the British in the Treaty of Paris. The British would split Florida into 2 colonies and name St. Augustine as the capital of East Florida. They would also, as previously mentioned, rename the fort to Fort St. Mark. This period of British ownership would last only 2 decades, as England would once again be at war on the continent. The rebellion colonies, soon to be called the United States, would try unsuccessfully to recruit Canada as well as both Floridas to their side. St. Augustine and the Floridas as a whole would remain loyal to the British Crown, and Fort St. Mark would see little action, largely due to the lack of a naval force to be bombarding the fort, and land fighting being further north. Skirmishes did occur around the fort, like at Alligator Creek, but they were minor in scope. That's not to say that Fort St. Mark didn't play some part in the American Revolution. Several founding fathers would be imprisoned in its walls, such as Christopher Gadsden, Thomas Hayward Jr., Arthur Middleton, and Edward Rutledge. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and due to its late arrival as an ally to France, Spain would once again regain control of Fort St. Mark on July 12, 1784. For the most part, this second Spanish period would be relatively quiet. That is, until after the War of 1812, when Andrew Jackson would lead the United States Army into Florida in a show of force over a weaker and largely non-existent landlord. In 1819, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams would negotiate a treaty with Spain to formally cede the two Floridas to the United States. The Castillo de San Marco would undergo another name change, this time to Fort Marion, named after the Revolutionary War hero, the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion. By this point in time, Florida was a backwater militarily to the country, with its main agitator being the wars with the Seminole Indians. There would be 3 separate periods of fighting, each moving further from St. Augustine. Fort Marion's role too would be diminished, with it being used more as a prison. Its most famous prisoner at this point in time would be Seminole leader Osceola. Yet again, the American continent would soon see war, this time on its largest scale yet. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, southern states would begin to leave the Union, led by South Carolina. In January 1861, Florida would follow the rest of the Deep South and become a member of the Confederacy. Union troops would abandon the fort, leaving a lone soldier in charge. When Florida troops demanded the fort be turned over, the soldier refused, unless a receipt could be obtained. The Florida troops produced such a document, and the fort was formally turned over to the Confederacy. The fort would serve little value, being far removed from the main fighting in Virginia and Mississippi, so its cannon were removed and sent to those theaters. Only 5 would remain in the water battery. Its possession by Confederate forces would be brief as well, as Lincoln's blockade began to grow. On March 11, 1862, Acting Mayor Cristobal Bravo officially surrendered the fort and the city to U.S. naval forces under Commander Christopher Raymond Perry Rogers. From then on, the fort would enter the next phase of its existence, as a military prison. During the war, it would hold numerous Confederate prisoners. After 1865, it would be home to many Native American prisoners. By 1875, numerous Indians would be held in captivity, including Chiefs Whitehorse and Graybeard. 12 years later, 491 Apaches would be captive within its walls, including the wife of Chief Geronimo. For the final time in the 20th century, war would descend on the United States. In 1898, after the Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, Spain and America would participate in the Spanish-American War. It was a short-lived affair, but several thousand troops would be stationed in Florida, ready to ship off to Cuba. This also meant a lot of deserters, and over 200 would be held inside the Castillo de San Marcos. At the turn of the century, the fort would be decommissioned as an active base, and as was the case with many other establishments, it would be briefly reactivated for World War I. In 1921, the moat was filled in and transformed into an artillery battery. In 1924, it would be declared a national monument, and by 1933, was deactivated as an active base once again. During World War II, its original name would be restored, and that's how it would remain for the next 79 years. If you enjoyed watching this video, head over to Twitter and follow me at PastAndPresent4, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.